let me share PowerPoint, and this is some of it is rather for my reference, so don't worry if you can't read all of it. But it is, I want to share some of the insights and make some reflections on the work of our social media and hate group research group here at Indiana University. We've been working on mostly on Twitter, but not only on Twitter, trying to make sense of what is happening there. And I would say, so this is a team, and I think most of these the research on social media, it's very complex very often because it gets into a lot of technical issues, and often it's very helpful, at least if you have a team who work with, so that it's, I think, also productive. But in general, I have to say, and Ayel, you pointed out to the the fact that some of these social media platforms, they are very, very young, and also our research on anti-Semitism online in general, but also specifically on social media, is really in its infancy. We're really only at the beginning of it, and how to make sense of it. And there are a number of obstacles, but I think there are 6 questions I think we should try to answer some of. So, what does anti-Semitism on social media look like? What kind of forms, manifestations do we find? How widespread it is, and where do we see it? Who is pushing this or anti-Semitic narratives, and maybe who are the anti-Semites who try to put some limits to it or speak out against it? And what's the impact? I think we should be clear, trying to be clear on that. And then also, as scholars, what can we do really to combat the anti-Semitic concept here? So, what does it look like? We will see. I think we saw a little bit this morning, but then we'll see, I think, in the next 2 presentations as well, some examples. And we can find, I think, anything you can imagine, we can find online in some form of social media or on websites or in chat groups. You can find really anything in words, visuals, audio, videos. And this goes from some stereotypical descriptions of Jews who might be not as hateful as some other anti-Semitic conspiracy fantasies, or even directly attacking Jews online, or calling for violence against Jews offline, or glorifying violence against Jews, even streamlining or live streaming physical attacks on Jews. So you can really find anything. And you can find also fragments or entire theories of comes from vast variety of ideological sources. So, and I don't want to go into that. It's just a matter of time if you to find it. But then to answer the question how widespread it is and where do you find it, that is more complicated than many might think. These platforms are highly diversified, and you have many different platforms. One thing is that if you find this, or whether you find this easily or you're fed even anti-Semitic content depends very much on your preferences or previous behavior, because most of the platforms use algorithms that feed you information or other posts that are related to what you have clicked on previously. But in any case, it's pretty easy to find anti-Semitic content if you look for it. But as I said, you also get fed anti-Semitic content, and on some platforms more than on others. And on some fringe platforms, it is very prevalent even. So Ayal mentioned Gap, but there's also, this morning was mentioned 4chan and 8chan. So these are platforms that are known to have very anti-Semitic users, mostly from the neo-Nazi type. What are recent developments? So the social media platforms, they have come under pressure recently. And this is a kind of new development in the last 3 years or so, that the social media platforms, the companies, they have increasingly committed to themselves to reduce hate speech. So there has been rising pressure from governments, NGOs, users, and customers. So that means those who pay for advertisement. And this has led to some deplatforming of some mainstream platforms, such as Twitter and Facebook. And we know from some research, for example, from Professor Rogers from the University of Amsterdam, those who have been deplatformed, mostly people from the extreme right, they have been deplatformed and they have then popped up on other platforms, but they have far less followers on these fringe platforms, and it's also more difficult for them to monitor us, to live off their hate, which has in the past generated a lot of followers, and therefore also they could monetize it. Because that is made a little bit more difficult for some of these disseminators of anti-Semitic content. Despite that, we can see from some studies that there is still an increase of anti-Semitism on even the mainstream social media platforms. That is often difficult to measure. So one, the social media companies are not transparent. So they don't provide data that would be necessary to really verify. And it's also difficult to access the data, technically difficult to access the data that we get. Twitter is a little bit or much easier than many other platforms. That's one of the reasons why we use Twitter. But one study that came out of, I think, a week ago or so, from Wyman and Natalie Masri, they looked at TikTok. They did a study a year ago, just with some keywords, trying to find anti-Semitic content, and they published this a year ago. And TikTok promised them to, after backlash, promised to enforce their terms of services that includes banning of hate speech. And then a year later, they did this study with the same keywords, and in fact, there was much more anti-Semitic content. And our study on Twitter also suggests that there's an increase of content, even percentage-wise, on Twitter. And I show you some of the results. So, how to measure that? If you want to measure the the scope of anti-Semitism, so how widespread it is, first of all, as I said, you have this problem of access data, but then also what's really an anti-Semitic message or user, and what can you measure them? So I want to go over that briefly. So I think, and that's what we did, we can use the ARA definition to classify if message is anti-Semitic or not. And if we want to use automated detection, if we want to use our own algorithms to find anti-Semitic content in the vast amount of messages, then we need what is called a labeled or annotated corpus or gold standard that has a number of anti-Semitic and non-anti-Semitic tweets, and that we can then use to do that. So we're trying to build this right now based on the IRA definition. There are some challenges with the IRA definition. So some of the wordings of it is rather implicit language. So for example, it has classic anti-Semitism. So I think all of you know roughly what that is. It has to be spelled out so that we can clearly say this is anti-Semitic and this is not anti-Semitic. So we did so. We spelled this out, put it up in a longer document. We call inferences of the IRA definition. Another problem is that on social media, very often, you don't know who the person behind a message is. So it's very difficult to see an intent really in there. Sometimes you have even robots sending out messages, sometimes completely randomly sending out messages, for example, quoting Shakespeare, right? Randomly a phrase from Shakespeare. But this can be an anti-Semitic phrase. And then the reader does not know if that's a robot or not. So we have to really without the intent behind it, but rather how that's perceived. So there are some of these challenges, but I think they can be overcome. And then what to measure? So do you want to measure the number of anti-Semitic messages on a certain platform? Do you want to measure the percentage of the messages of the overall content, or the percentage of anti-Semitic users? And how do you count for the followers, the number of followers, the retweets, the likes and views? So it's not so easy as it might seem to say, well, is there a lot or less content, and how do you measure this? What we did, we had the privilege to use the data from a larger project here at Indiana University. They have an agreement with Twitter that they get 10% of all tweets on a representative basis. So we were able to use that database and did queries on that. And we did representative samples from that for certain keywords. We focused here on Jews keyword. So these are conversations about Jews. And we got, as you see, large numbers of tweets. And then we built representative samples from that and went over them manually. And we did so by creating an annotation portal so that it visualizes the tweet and then has our form beneath it. And these questions that we have the annotators, two annotators went over each single tweet in our corpus of about 4,000 tweets. So saying, is this anti-Semitic or not, according to IRA? What kind of sentiment is attached to it? Is that related to the Holocaust, or is that tweet maybe even calling out anti-Semitism or anti-Semites? So after going over these tweets, we had a certain percentage of tweet we could classify as anti-Semitic. And you see for these keywords, conversations on Jews, it's less than with insults such as Zainazi or Kikes, which have a much higher percentage of anti-Semitic messages among them. And if you look at the timeline there, so with some margins of error, we can say in 2019, in these conversations about Jews, there were around 7% anti-Semitic tweet. And there was an increase during a time when Twitter said they had tracked down and deleted anti-Semitic users and messages, which in fact often they did. So we had many of the tweets that we we looked at some point were then deleted, and this is only for live tweets. So there was an increase, a significant increase from 2019 to summer 2020 that we can demonstrate. Right, and now another interesting question is, I think, who is pushing that? So if we want to look at this, it's also well, very interesting, of course, and you need to, or it's interesting to know that the peaks in these conversations, when you see a large number of messages that are dealing with this conversation, these peaks are related to very often to offline events, to some controversial statements. So this is from the year 2019 from Trump, or attacks on Jews, like the Jersey city shooting, or the stabbing a little bit later. And you see this also for the time periods. If we don't have time to go into that, but then if you have the question, okay, who are the most influential users on these conversations about Jews? Well, you could go by most followers, you could go by users with most tweets, or you could go by most often mentioned. These would be different measures. So most followers, that is probably not super productive, because then you get these media outlets, like CNN, New York Times, but also Sarah Silverman has a lot of followers. Influences, I think it's interesting. So in the top 10 influences, you have Donald Trump, but he was quoted very often by those who were sending anti-Semitic message, but also those who were calling out anti-Semitic message. But Ilhan Omar was among the top 10. Jeremy Corbyn as well. AOC and Rashida Tlaib. So this was, and for another period. And if you go further down the list, you find some who regularly send anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic messages, as if not now, or even further down the list. I don't have it here, but you also have Khomeini's account, who was, I think, recently taken offline. All right, so another interesting question, I think, that does not have enough attention so far, it's who's pushing against it. So who's pushing against it? Often the problem is that those who push against it, they don't necessarily meet those who push for it. These can be separate social media circles, if you want, right? They don't read each other necessarily. So but still, the voices that push against it are interesting, and it's also good to know what kind of narratives distinguish those who send anti-Semitic messages from those who send something against it, who do not send anti-Semitic messages. And here you can make distinctions in the text of the tweets. And this is interesting for later machine learning approaches, that you can distinguish really the text. I don't go into that very much. It depends a little bit on the keyword that you use, but you have enough in yellow here that you can make distinction that is distinctive for those who have anti-Semitic messages and those who don't. And this is only to say, well, there is a kind of or there is at least enough separation between the anti-Semitic and the non-anti-Semitic users that, and also in the hashtags, it shows that clearly, that we can come to the conclusion that social media companies, they could very well do also this distinction. lot of more data than we have. And what they said a few years ago, and that they still are saying very often, is that the technology is not there. That does not seem to be right. So that is to say, we could contribute to building up more pressure on social media companies with research that shows that they could, in fact, do more. Going back to the impact, and here I can skip all these slides because I'll write that greatly. Social media, this is a part of many people's life today. Just to say, of course, the younger people use that more. Interestingly, women use that more, and also interesting minorities use social media more than others. But here, just some numbers for the US of those who use social media. So it's really majority of Americans use social media today to varying degrees, 65 minutes on average, and on various platforms. Facebook is the biggest, but YouTube, Instagram, Twitter are all also big, and it really depends on the age also, what kind of platforms you use. I will skip this news information, but TikTok, as Ayal mentioned, in 2019 it was just 4% and was not really existing, and now we have 30% of teens using this platform. So there are a lot of changes, and people don't just passively look at it or just have it there. They really engage on social media. So it's really an interactive thing. So if they see something anti-Semitic, there is it's likely that they engage, right? Again, why is this relevant? Well, there is direct exclusion of Jews from social media circles. Against Jews online, we have studies that show on this direct attack on Jewish journalists, such as Rosenberg or Ben Shapiro, and recently Eve Barlow was attacked. She wrote a piece on that, speaking of social media pogrom, and maybe Daniel knows more about this, but we can also see, of course, that's a radicalization of anti-Semites who attack online and also offline, and the radicalization often happens very quickly on social media, because the limit is really how much you can consume. You don't have to meet anyone, so that you can radicalize really quickly. And of course, this spread of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories is a threat to democracy, and maybe we can go more into about that, why I think this, but what can research do to combat this? And I come to my conclusions here is, well, first, I think our project and also others, I think, have shown, well, the ARA definition can be really used to work with in a research context. It's until today the most comprehensive and standardized definition to classify anti-Semitic content. Of course, it's maybe not a philosophically satisfying definition, but to classify it, it's really workable, and it can be applied to these messages. And the research that we can do, even if we lack the access to the data, can show, or enough access to the data, shows that there's a lack of implementation of the hate speech rules that are there in the terms of services, and that there are anti-Semitic users, and it's interesting to find out who they are, so either individual or state-sponsored. What we find also, even our little research, we find indications that some of it is state-sponsored. And I think there needs to be more research on the online-offline relation. And Ayala and I talked about it about a year ago even, and there is not enough research on that. There is some promising research also by Finkelstein, I think. He tries to look really into these relations, and what this is interesting to be able to maybe at some point predict what kind of narratives lead to violence, or even where offline attacks use might happen. What I think we need more forcefully is a conversation about what kind of anti-Semitic content should be censored. So this whole idea that we should ban everything, I think we really need a serious conversation about this. That's not really started. So if someone uses an anti-Semitic stereotype that would be anti-Semitic according to the IRA definition, saying all Jews are rich, do we want this to be banned from Twitter entirely? But I think this is can also be resolved when we say, well, this should at least not be promoted. So because what happens often, as I said earlier, there are algorithms that push certain narratives. So this pushing of anti-Semitic content is, in a sense, in the logic of many of the social media companies, that controversial content is being pushed to generate more attention. Okay, I think I'll leave it here, and then we hopefully can discuss some of it later on. Thank you.